Hey. Step to the microphone, truth on the line. Oh. Jeremy Jones brings the facts, one story at a time. Oh. From the courthouse hall to the 4-county road, he's asking who benefits and who bears the load. The mic goes live, the people lean in, he cuts through the noise and gets past the spin. Jeremy Jones bringing the truth to light, law and local politics, wrong or right. From the courthouse steps to the county line, the Jeremy Jones Show, Northwest Georgia prime time. No smoke, no mirrors, no polished disguise, just hard questions and straight replies. From City Hall to the stories you know, Northwest Georgia, this is your show. Jeremy Jones bringing the truth to light, law and local politics, wrong or right. From the courthouse steps to the county line, the Jeremy Jones Show, Northwest Georgia prime time. The Jeremy Jones Show, law, politics, and the stories close to home.
Okay, how about that?
Northwest Georgia.
We got a theme song, sort of. Thank the person that used AI to make that for me. I don't know if she or he wanted me to give credit, so I won't yet, but I actually have a couple different versions. Once we decide on a version, fine-tune it a little bit. If credit is warranted, well, it is warranted. If it's wanted, I will certainly give credit. But we're still playing with it, so anyway, we'll have some fun with that. Welcome back. Shockingly, we're still figuring out how to do this. Here we are for our third regular episode. We did have a special breaking news episode a lot earlier than I anticipated, but with it being our third episode, it is going to be the first time that we have our corrections segment. And what I mean by that, look, I strive for accuracy. That's the number one thing. I brag on Facebook, and I say on Facebook all the time, I'm always right. Not because I'm so smart, not because I'm infallible. I just try, and usually do, not post things until I have researched it, and researched it thoroughly. Obviously, mistakes can and do happen, and if I find a mistake, I certainly want to get that corrected as quickly as possible. So, one of the things that I said in the last episode, we were talking about how the chief public defender gets his job, his or her job, and I wasn't quite sure how it was, so I was speaking from memory, and one of the things that I got wrong is I said something that at one point in time the governor might be involved, and that's not true. It's always the committee that I talked about, but it's a board, and that board interviews candidates, makes a suggestion to the state, the head state person of the Public Defenders Council, and then right now it's a she, and she will hire and then obviously retain the public defender as the council recommends, or to her, however she wants to do it. So anyway, the governor's never involved. It's the only mistake that I made in the last thing. One other thing I want to make, I don't think it's a mistake, but I think that some people misunderstood or mistook what I said, so I want to correct that too. In the special breaking news episode that we had, I talked about the school board suing the commission, and that came to light after Commissioner Tharp put his own video out, and I kind of used that as a springboard for mine. I even saw him that night and thanked him for giving me a good topic to discuss. Some people on Facebook interpreted that I was attacking Tharp for his comments, and that's not true. In fact, I wholly compliment Commissioner Tharp on what he did. It's what everybody should do. He asked a question. He wants clarification. So he let his constituents know, look, this is something, it doesn't make sense to me. I know it doesn't make sense to you. And this was a breaking news type thing, so I don't blame him going out to the people right away. And I just want answers. I want to look into it, is basically what he was saying. The issue I had and who I was complaining about were the people who saw this $10 million interest payment or this bond purchase and just jumping to the conclusion, well, that's wrong, they shouldn't do that, with no research, no effort whatsoever. Those are the people that I was making fun of. Certainly not Commissioner Tharp. I greatly respect him, and I'm glad that he's on the commission, and I look forward to him being a public servant for a very long time in any office that he wants to run for. So, anyway, those are the two corrections. One correction, one clarification, I guess you could say. But what we're going to talk about today is Colin Gray. Well, who's Colin Gray? Colin Gray is the dad of the shooter in the Apalachee, I think or something school in Barrow County, Georgia. He's the dad. And if you recall, the dad was charged because his son shot people at the school, killed 4 people, injured a lot of others. Look, it's real easy to say, wait a second, why are we going after the dads for something the kids did? That's not what happens. It's not what happens in common law. It's not how people can't be responsible for what other people did, and you certainly generally don't have a duty to help anybody if you don't want to. The famous final episode of Seinfeld, the Good Samaritan law. We don't have those types of things here. If you see somebody getting mugged on the street, you have no responsibility or duty to go intervene with it, unless somehow or another you were the reason that they were getting mugged, which is unlikely, unless you're the mugger. But laws evolve and laws change. So when I first heard about it, I questioned it as a defense attorney. I did what I try to do all the time, and that is, well, let's let this process play out. Let's see what's going on. Well, the process has played out. The dad has been sentenced to 15 years in prison, and he was found guilty of second-degree murder, 2 counts of that, cruelty to children, a bunch of counts of that, reckless conduct, a bunch of counts of that, and involuntary manslaughter, a couple of counts of that. So, what I want to do today is we're going to do a deep dive. If you do not like law, if you don't want to understand how the law works, turn this episode off, because you will find zero interest in this. I'm going to attack this just like a lawyer does, so you get an insight to see how defense lawyers, at least that's how I attack cases and how I look at them and how I evaluate them. Obviously, in this, I'm not advocating for the father in this case. I'm looking at this from a neutral standpoint, so I'm not going to advocate for him. So I'll be looking at it from both sides, and you're going to hear me compliment the prosecutor on a couple of occasions. So, first of all, let's talk about the charges that were made. So, first of all, one thing that I did find interesting, the dad was charged with second-degree murder the day after the shooting. That was red flag number 1 for me. That's when I knew there was something up. There is something more to this story than we know, than what was being reported at the time. We later find out this kid was on the radar before this happened. FBI's already interviewed Dad, so they knew something about it. So that now explains how they were able to do a serious charge of murder in the second degree the day after the event happened. Whether or not they had all the information that they needed for the prosecution at that time, I don't know. But they at least thought they had one little tidbit that I'll get into in just a minute. So he's charged with murder in the second degree, and that's a big one. So when I get a case, when I get an indictment on a case, the first thing I do is I read the indictment. I mean, it's a pretty simple thing. And from that indictment, we defense attorneys read the elements that the state has outlined in the indictment, because in trial, the state is going to have to prove every single element, essential element, in that indictment. So I look at the elements that they put out in the indictment. Obviously, they're always going to cite a code section of the law. Then, of course, I pull the code section and read all the elements of the crime in that. And then we break that down, and that's what the state has to prove. And they have to bat at 1,000. They have to be 100% right. They have to prove every element beyond a reasonable doubt. So when you hear the term beyond a reasonable doubt, it applies to every element. One of the things I say in my closing that's 100% true, if a particular crime has 100 elements and my client stands up and says, I did 99 of those things right there, but the state can't prove that 100th thing beyond a reasonable doubt, the law dictates that's a not guilty verdict. It doesn't matter that 99 out of 100 elements were proven. Some people might think that's kind of extreme. Well, I can tell you this, there are no laws that have 99 elements in them. But they can get complicated, and this one does, so let's go through it. So first of all, murder in the second degree. So Georgia law says it's a OCGA 16-5-1, subsection D. A person commits the offense of murder in the second degree when, in the commission of cruelty to children in the second degree, he or she causes the death of another human being, irrespective of malice. So malice has nothing to do with murder in the second degree. Now, there's something very significant in that one. A person commits the offense of murder in the second degree when, in the commission of cruelty to children in the second degree. So there must be cruelty to children in the second degree before you can even get to murder in the second degree. So, if I were doing this case, and this was the indictment that I was handed, and I read that, the first thing I would do is, well, what's cruelty to children in the second degree? So we would pull our code. Look, I got paper and everything this time. In which, by the way, he would have to be charged with cruelty to children in the second degree, and he was. So, cruelty to children in the second degree reads as follows. A person commits the offense of cruelty to children in the second degree when such person, with criminal negligence, causes a child under the age of 18 cruel or excessive physical or mental pain. Now, at this point, I'm kind of scratching my head. Well, how did the dad cause any of those people, any of those kids, cruel and excessive physical or mental pain? Obviously, the kids experienced excessive physical or mental pain. Ones who were shot obviously had both physical and mental. The ones who experienced it clearly had mental, I would assume. So we know the kids experienced it, but did the dad cause it with his criminal negligence? So we have to look into that. So let's look at the indictment on count 2. And this is how every charge for cruelty to the children in the second degree reads. It has all the standard language, the boilerplate language that's in an indictment, and I'll just get to the meat of it here. That he did on the 4th day of September 2024, did with criminal negligence cause child under the age of 18 years old cruel and excessive physical pain by consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk that his act of allowing his son, Colin Gray, access to a firearm and ammunition after receiving sufficient warning that Colin Gray would harm and endanger the bodily safety of another. There's a lot to unpack here, and this is going to be the first compliment that I give to the prosecutor. As a defense attorney, I love this. I love this if I got this case and knew nothing about it, because the first thing my mind runs to, that's a lot of things that they're painting themselves into, that they've got to prove, and they've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. If they don't prove just one of those things beyond a reasonable doubt, the jury is required to come back with a not guilty verdict, and I assure you, I remind the jury of that. So they put in a lot of things here, and what they said was, after receiving sufficient warning that Colin Gray would harm and endanger the bodily safety of another. What is sufficient warning? And that's the part that the state really went out on a limb, because there's no definition of sufficient warning. Sufficient warning is going to come from what do the jurors believe is sufficient warning. And we're going to get into that in details in just a second. So now let's look at the final, no, not the final, but the other charge of involuntary manslaughter. The person commits the offense of involuntary manslaughter when he causes the death of another human being without any intention to do so by the commission of an unlawful act other than a felony. A person who commits the offense, and then talks about that. So there has to be the commission of another act for there to be an involuntary manslaughter. So then, again, we go back to the indictment. What does the state say happened in the involuntary manslaughter charges? And on this, the state says that on the 4th day of September 2024, while in the commission of an unlawful act, comma, reckless conduct, as alleged in count 6 of this indictment, comma, did cause the death of a human being without the intention to do so. So the state has said the unlawful act that's not a felony that was committed was reckless conduct. Well, what is reckless conduct? Well, Georgia defines it for us. Reckless conduct. A person who causes bodily harm or, and this is the part that's important, endangers the bodily safety of another by consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk that his or her act or omission will cause harm or endanger the safety of the other person, and the disregard constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of care which a reasonable person would exercise in this situation. Now, folks, that is a lot. Now, remember, they cannot get a conviction of involuntary manslaughter by the way they wrote it unless they get a conviction on the reckless conduct. So the reckless conduct is the key to this because you can't get to the involuntary manslaughter until there's a conviction for the reckless conduct. In the reckless conduct, the legislature has given a lot of elements here that have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And first part is consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk that his or her act or omission will cause harm or danger to the safety of another. So there's no definition for substantial and unjustifiable risk. That's what the jury's for. The jury decides that. And then it goes on, it constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of care which a reasonable person would exercise. Well, what's the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise? Again, there's no definition for a reasonable person. That's up to the jury. So, there's no law anywhere that says you get a jury of your peers, but we hear that a lot. And the reason that comes about is you do pick the jury from your community. So people talk about the slippery slope and what are we going to do about this. The state of Georgia is relying on members of the community or a like community. In this case, they had to get a jury from an adjoining county, but it had similar makeup. I might argue it was a little bit more too rural for what they where they live, but they're adjoining counties. That might be an issue for an appeal, I think. But anyway, but the community decides what is reasonable care. So an identical case could be tried in rural Georgia versus downtown San Francisco, and you might get two completely different outcomes because the members of those two different communities might define reasonable care or substantial and unjustifiable risk in completely different ways. So you're in northeast Georgia, somewhere, middle Georgia, and Georgia's known to be a very gun-friendly state. We have some of the most lax gun laws in the state. You don't have to have a license to carry a weapon. As long as you're not a felon and you're eligible to carry it, you can carry it. And that's what the society wants. The NRA is very powerful here. The people who get elected to the legislature usually have NRA backing. So the state, this is the second compliment that I'll give to the prosecutor, though, is more about the legislature than the prosecutor. The legislature has written this. It's going to be up to the jury to decide if this was reasonable, if there were unjustifiable risk. So the jury clearly believed that the father's actions constituted reckless conduct. If you get reckless conduct, that means you can get involuntary manslaughter because there has to be an unlawful act. That's not a felony. And in the indictment, the unlawful act that they chose to prosecute was reckless conduct. So you see how these two things work? You cannot get, the way this was charged, you cannot get involuntary manslaughter conviction unless you get a conviction on reckless conduct. You cannot get the second-degree murder conviction unless you get the cruelty to children conviction. So that's what the state has chosen to do. So what did the dad do? And this is the part that, we didn't know this. We didn't know this until it came out in the trial. And once it came out in the trial, you kind of had to scratch your head. And I try to put myself in a juror's position. What would I have done? And, I don't know. I've got notes from what people took. I paid as close attention to this trial as I could, but again, it was mostly from not mostly, it was completely from the eyes of other people, but I tried to get a wide swath of viewpoints, conservative, liberal, everything. But first of all, let's get back to why did he get charged the day after the shooting? It was because they were already on the radar, because a year before, in May of 2023, they went and interviewed the dad because there had been threats to certain schools in the area. There was nothing specific, but just some vague threats online that they traced back to this house. So they go and they interview Dad, and Dad said, "Oh, listen, I'm not my kid. My kid could never do that. I have all the guns here, and they're all locked up. He has no access to them." So Dad is already, at that point in time, is put on notice. Okay, somebody from this house has made a threat to schools. But I'm not worried about it because I have my guns locked up. The FBI didn't have any other information to go on. They didn't have any probable cause, so no arrests got made then. Got to take the dad at the word at this point in time. They didn't have any evidence to make any charges, apparently. And I believe that to be true. But that put him on the radar. Dad said, I keep the guns locked up. It's very important. So then we go on. What else did the dad do? Here's the types of things that came out in the trial. And one of the things was the shooter, the son, told relatives, and it got back to Dad, and Dad knew this was being said. I'm hearing voices in my head to cause harm. Well, Dad looked up counselors, but he never sought counseling. Now I'm going to take a little aside here. If that was the only testimony that was given, I would give Dad the benefit of the doubt, because the mental health system in our state is horrendous. We have got to do a better job. There's got to be more state resources. I have people that are sitting in jail waiting on mental health resources. They don't have any money. They can't just go out and get it. They don't have insurance. So they're waiting on state facilities, and they are in jail for sometimes over a year waiting on help. If Dad could not get help, I would almost give that a pass. But that's not the case here. Apparently, he did have insurance. But the most important thing is he never followed up with any of it. So he didn't even get to make the excuse at court. Well, I called, but they gave me the price. I couldn't afford it. So we tried to do this. We tried to do that. We applied for this program. We applied for that. He couldn't say any of those things because all he did was call about counseling and then never follow up. Apparently, some of them even called him back and he didn't return their phone calls. So he didn't get the counseling. Is that enough? Probably not by itself. So what else happened? So he still, even though people are saying your son's hearing voices, he didn't remove the access to the guns. Remember what he told the FBI? All the guns, he doesn't have access to those. Don't worry about him. My kid's not going to shoot up anybody. All my guns are locked up. Then he was frequently absent from school. He missed the entire 8th grade, an entire school year. Now, does that put somebody on notice that your kid's going to be a school shooter? Absolutely not. But it's a piece of the puzzle that's part of this. Your kid's not even going to school. It may not show any propensity for the kid to commit these crimes, but it certainly shows you're a shitty father. It certainly shows you don't know what you're doing or you don't care as a dad. You know, I've been in juvenile court. I've dealt with truancy before. I know that there are parents out there who struggle, who take their kids to school and they walk out the back door of the school, and I know that there's some issues there. But an entire year of school and he did nothing about it. I mean, that just amplifies, as the judge called it, warning lights flashing brighter and brighter. He missed an entire year of school. The dad is not paying attention, and worse, if he is paying attention, he doesn't care. But then the one that got me, if there's any of them that could stand on their own, and I'm not saying this one can stand on its own, but if there's any of them that can stand on its own, it's this one. The kid had a shrine. Pictures and news articles of the Parkland shooter. I had a picture of the Parkland shooter. I'm not going to say his name. They had the picture of the Parkland shooter on his wall. Dad testified that, yeah, I saw that. I thought that was the guy from Green Day. Okay, fair enough. I don't know what the Parkland shooter looks like. My kid says, that's the singer from Green Day. What am I supposed to say? But not only did the kid not say, no, that's not him, he just said, he said that is him. The kid didn't lie. He didn't say who it was. There are newspaper articles next to that picture about the Parkland shooting. There's a tiny, tiny connection that the dad had to make right there to figure out, wait, why does my son have this shrine to a school shooter? And how many other shrines does he have? Does he need to look further in around? I don't know. But that one, again, I don't think it is by itself, but if there is one that by itself could be this conscious disregard that we talk about, that would be it. But it's not the only thing. There are other things. But the dad ignored that. We talked about the statements about voices in the head, and we talked about the counseling. And there's one other thing that he did. So when they talked about the counseling, dad, who all of a sudden, I guess, decided he was a psychotherapist, decided that what the son needed was some good antidepressants. Now, you may or may not know this, but you can't generally get antidepressants without a prescription. Well, fortunately, they had a prescription. Unfortunately, it was for his mother. Yes, he gave his son the antidepressant pills that were prescribed to his mother. Now, I don't know enough about antidepressant medication to speak in any type of authority, but I've seen enough commercials to know very dangerous for kids, don't give them to kids without supervision, may cause suicidal thoughts, and if you're suicidal, my guess is you're homicidal. And more importantly, I know that there are different levels, and I know from my experience in court, when I have clients who are prescribed psychomedications, sometimes they have to come back 2 or 3 times to get the levels adjusted. And how doctors decide what levels are the right levels and wrong levels, I don't know. But what I do know is what's good for mom is not necessarily going to be what's good for son. But Dr. Dad here decided that's what he was going to do. Finally, we get to the state of mind of not just the dad, but of the family. But the kid's sister had nothing to do, had no responsibility, of course. When the shooting was taking place and it was hitting the news, Dad and his daughter / the shooter's sister are texting. And she says, I think you and I are thinking the same thing. So Dad hears of the school shooting, and the first thing he thinks is, oh crap, I bet that's my son. That just goes to the state of mind, man. That's a bad thing. I say all the time on Facebook, never talk to the police. You know, if you think your family member's the one killing somebody, maybe not put that in a text message, okay? And then he tells his work, hey, I got to go. My son broke his arm. His son didn't break his arm. He also didn't want to tell his workmates, hey, my son's probably that shooter. So he leaves work because his son broke his arm. And while he's at home, the police show up. And what is his first words? I knew it. I knew it. So it just goes, he knew there was a problem. And he did nothing about it. Now, what I thought of when this first came out that he was being charged, my thought was, what are we going to do? Start charging parents whose kids get into a car wreck, charge them for vehicular homicide because they let their kids drive? No, not on one time. But what this case does stand for, if your kid gets in a wreck, and you don't do any type of classes, you don't do any type of discipline, you don't take the car away, you don't do something else about it, but you just keep letting your kid have wreck after wreck after wreck, you know, on the 5th or 6th wreck, if it kills somebody, you might get charged with something. So, can it be a slippery slope? Yeah, probably. I mean, most things can be. I can imagine how it can be. But what was established by this case, that if the appeals court holds this case up, these are some pretty high standards. And not only are they high standards, most of the things that are required to be proven were required to be proven by the jurors of that community. The jurors of that community decided what was reasonable care. What should the dad have done? Is what the dad did reasonable or unreasonable? And because it was left to that makes it a little bit easier for me to digest that we're charging parents for what their kids did. But by no means do I want this to turn into something where anytime a kid does something, all of a sudden we start going after the parents. And school shootings obviously are a hot topic. And it's going to be very easy for next time there's a school shooting for somebody to say, hey, remember what happened in Georgia? Let's go charge the parents for this. A lot of ignorant people will say that. You now, since you've sat through this 30-minute podcast, are not an ignorant person. You won't say that. You might say, let's look into that parent, make sure they did what they're supposed to do. Were there any warning signs that should have been heeded? If that's proven, then maybe we have new charges against a parent. I don't know. But if this is the standard we're going to use to hold parents accountable for what their kids did when they shoot up a school, I'm probably okay with it. The dad didn't do anything. He just didn't do anything. One of the things that the judge said that I agree with, the signs were there, the lights were flashing brighter and brighter, and this was brought up 100 times, and I said to myself, I'm not going to bring it up, everybody else does, but I can't ignore it. Despite all of these issues, despite being visited by the FBI, he buys his son a gun. And under the theory of, well, I wanted him to stop playing video games and take him hunting, and it would be something we can bond on. How many times did y'all go hunting? How many times did y'all go target practicing? How many times did you get bonded? Probably none. Or very little. At least that's what the jury believed. So anyway, that's my take on this. I appreciate you listening. And I've already got the topic for next week ready to go. We're going to talk about flock cameras. So there's lots of discussion on the Facebook about that. I think you might be surprised at what I say, what my viewpoint is. We're going to talk about some Supreme Court law. And as always, if any breaking news happens that I feel moved to do a quick podcast, I certainly will. But thank you very much for listening, and have a good day, week, whatever. I'll see you next time. Good night.
Northwest Georgia prime time. No smoke, no mirrors, no polished skies, just hard questions and straight replies. From City Hall to the stories you know. Northwest Georgia, this is your show. Jeremy Jones bringing truth to light, law and local politics, wrong or right. From the courthouse steps to the county line, the Jeremy Jones Show. Northwest Georgia prime time.